John Reynolds sat across from his wife, Claire, in the dimly lit kitchen, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them. Their dinner, nothing special, just a simple salad and grilled chicken, felt like a formality. They had eaten together like this countless times before, yet tonight it felt different. The space between them seemed wider than it ever had been, and for reasons John couldn't fully articulate, his heart felt heavy. It wasn't just the weight of a long workday. It was the sense of something unspoken, something that had been festering for weeks. Claire sliced her chicken, the clink of the knife against the plate too loud in the stillness. She glanced up briefly, her eyes avoiding his, before lowering her gaze back to her plate. John felt a strange chill run through him. He had noticed the distance between them growing recently, a subtle shift that had been harder to ignore with each passing day. She had become more distant, more closed off. The conversations they once shared were now brief, almost perfunctory. "Claire," he started, his voice breaking through the silence. "What's going on? You've been different lately." She didn't immediately respond, instead taking a slow, deliberate bite of her food. John's eyes traced her every movement, the way her hands trembled slightly as she set her fork down. It wasn't the nervousness of a person who'd forgotten to bring up a grocery list. It was something deeper, more unsettling. She was hiding something. The question was, what? Finally, she put her fork down, wiped her mouth with a napkin, and met his eyes, her gaze steady but distant. "John, I need to talk to you about something." A knot formed in his stomach. He could feel it, the growing sense that this was it, the conversation he had been dreading, yet somehow knew was coming. "What is it?" His voice was tight, controlled, though inside he was bracing for whatever revelation was about to unfold. "I've been seeing someone else," she said quietly, almost as though the words had taken physical effort to say aloud. The world seemed to stop. John's fork clattered onto his plate, and he felt the color drain from his face. The room swam, the silence between them now an overwhelming presence that seemed to suffocate everything around him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat loud and painful. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. He could only stare at her, his mind racing to make sense of what she had just said. "Someone else?" he repeated, his voice hoarse. "What do you mean, Claire? Who?" She took a deep breath, her eyes flicking down to her lap. "His name is Adam," she said softly. "I've been seeing him for a few months now. It started innocently, just lunch breaks together at first, but it turned into something more." She paused, swallowing hard, as if the words were difficult to force out. "I'm sorry, John. I never meant for it to happen like this." John's thoughts spun wildly. The anger began to rise in him, followed by confusion, pain, and disbelief. Adam? Who was this man? What did he have that John couldn't offer? The questions, unspoken but pressing, crashed over him in waves. His chest tightened, and for a moment he could hardly breathe. "How long?" he choked out. "A few months," Claire repeated. I didn't mean for it to go this far, but I've been so lonely, John. I needed someone who made me feel seen, someone who cared about me." The words stung like a slap to the face. John could feel the bitterness rise in his throat, the sense of betrayal flooding his veins. All the years they had spent together, 7 years of marriage, countless moments of shared memories, promises made, seemed to disappear in that instant. All the love he had given her, the trust they had built, shattered before his eyes. "And you've been with him?" John asked, his voice dangerously low. She nodded, her face pale, and her voice broke as she added, "We kissed, John. We've crossed that line. And I feel guilty, but at the same time I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can go back." John's mind spun, the room feeling smaller by the second. His wife, his best friend, the mother of his children, had been unfaithful, and she was sitting there, not even trying to hide it, telling him the truth in the coldest, most matter-of-fact way. It felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. "I don't understand, Claire. Why now? Why him?" His voice cracked, the words coming out in a rush. "You've been unhappy with me? Is that it?" Claire shook her head quickly, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not just about him, it's about me, about how lost I've felt for so long. You You've been so wrapped up in your work, John, so distant. I needed someone to show me that I mattered. I'm sorry, I never meant to hurt you." John's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He wanted to lash out, to scream at her, to make her feel the weight of what she had done. But instead, he felt something else, something dark and hollow swelling inside him. "So what now, Claire?" His voice was dangerously calm. "What are we supposed to do with this? What's next?" She looked away, her tears falling freely now. I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I need to figure this out, John. I need space, but I don't want to lose you." "Then why would you do this to me?" he asked, the pain unmistakable in his tone. "Why betray me like this if you didn't want to lose me?" Claire fell silent, the weight of her own guilt pressing down on her. She had no answer. John stared at her for a long moment, his emotions too tangled to untangle in the heat of the moment. He felt betrayed, lost and disgusted. But underneath it all there was something else, a flicker of fear that he might lose her for good, a fear he wasn't ready to face. The silence between John and Claire stretched out like an unbreakable chain, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. John's mind was still reeling, his thoughts crashing into each other, unable to find purchase. The rawness of her words, "I have been seeing someone else," echoed in his ears, and yet a part of him still couldn't believe it. He stared at her, watching as she nervously wrung her hands in her lap, avoiding his gaze. His chest tightened with a mix of confusion and anger. He hadn't expected this, not after all the years they had spent together. Claire was supposed to be his constant, his partner in everything. They had promised each other forever. And now, in this moment, everything felt like it was crumbling to dust. "Why?" John asked quietly, his voice rough, barely audible. It was the only question that mattered, the one that needed an answer. "Why did you do it?" Claire took a shaky breath, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. She looked up at him, her face full of guilt, but also something else, something more difficult to name. Regret, perhaps. Fear. "I don't know," she whispered. "It's not just about Adam. It's about how I've been feeling for a long time. Like I'm invisible, John. I've been trying to fill a void that's been growing between us for months, years even. But I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I never planned for it to go this far." Her words hit John like a slap to the face, the emptiness, the loneliness that she felt. He understood now, but it also cut deeper than anything else. Had he really been that absent? He ran his hand through his hair, trying to process what Claire was saying. "So this was your solution?" His voice cracked. "To go out and find someone else? To betray everything we've built together?" Claire nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know it's wrong. I know I've hurt you. I don't even know why it went this far. Adam, he made me feel alive again. For the first time in a long time I felt seen, wanted." She stopped, shaking her head as though the words were choking her. "But I don't want to hurt you, John. I don't. But I needed to know. I needed to feel that I mattered to someone. I felt lost in this marriage. It wasn't about you not being good enough. It was just, I wasn't enough for myself anymore." John's heart twisted. The betrayal stung with each word she spoke, but the underlying truth of what Claire said struck him hard. He had been so wrapped up in his work, so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, that he had missed the quiet despair in Claire's eyes. He hadn't noticed the distance growing between them until it was too late. "So you let someone else in?" His voice was cold, distant, a sharp contrast to the storm of emotions inside him. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "How long has this been going on, Claire?" 6 months, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We started out just having lunch together, talking. It felt harmless at first, but then, I don't know. It escalated. We shared dinners, we kissed, and it felt like everything I'd been missing. It made me feel alive again. But I swear, John, it was never about you not being enough. It was about me trying to find something inside myself that I'd lost." The words she spoke were a mix of confusion, desperation, and guilt. Claire wasn't making excuses. She was trying to explain herself in the only way she knew how, but it didn't make it hurt any less for John. The betrayal felt like a shadow that was slowly swallowing him whole. John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He could feel the anger building again, but this time there was something else mixed in with it: disappointment. It wasn't just the affair that hurt him. It was the realization that Claire had been crying out for attention for so long and he hadn't been there. He had failed her in ways he hadn't realized. "You say it wasn't about me, but it feels like it is," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. "If I wasn't enough for you, then why did we stay together all these years? Why did we make promises? Why didn't you tell me how you were feeling? Why didn't you tell me that you were unhappy?" Claire's eyes filled with fresh tears, and her voice cracked as she spoke. "I didn't know how. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could handle it myself. But I couldn't. And now, I've hurt you in the worst possible way." There was a long silence between them. John couldn't bring himself to look at her. He felt too broken, too betrayed. But at the same time, he was confused. He wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but he also felt empty. Could he forgive her? Could he find a way to heal from this? Was this something that could ever be repaired? "I don't know what to say, Claire," he finally murmured, the weight of the words settling in his chest. "I don't know if I can even look at you the same way anymore. I'm sorry, John. I never wanted to hurt you. Please understand, I've been lost, and now, I'm so scared of losing you forever. I don't know what to do." John stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked toward the window, staring out at the street below. His mind was spinning, each thought more chaotic than the last. Part of him wanted to believe Claire. Part of him wanted to take her in his arms and promise that everything would be okay. But another part of him, the part that had been betrayed, couldn't forget what had happened. The trust was gone, and that was something that couldn't easily be repaired. After a long moment he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need time, Claire. I need time to think." Claire nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I understand. I'll give you as much time as you need." John left the room, his heart heavy, each step echoing in the silence that filled the house. The future that had once seemed so certain was now a fragile thread, and he wasn't sure how, or if, it could be mended. The house felt colder than usual as John stood in the hallway staring blankly at the floor. His thoughts were a whirlwind: confusion, anger, betrayal, and disbelief, each one fighting for space in his mind. He had asked for time to think, but now the reality of Claire's confession was all too real. The silence in the house was suffocating. He had never imagined his life would be turned upside down like this, not after everything they had shared. He needed answers, more than the vague words Claire had given him. He needed to understand how everything had spiraled so far out of control. The idea of Adam, this stranger who had crept into their lives, felt like a foreign, jagged thing lodged in his chest. Why her? Why now? John couldn't shake the image of Claire's tear-streaked face, the guilt in her eyes, the confession that had torn apart the life they had built together. As he made his way back to the kitchen, he saw her sitting at the table, her hands clasped together in front of her, her posture stiff as though she too was waiting for the next move in this fractured game. "Claire," he said, his voice harder than he intended, but there was no turning back now. "We need to talk. Really talk." She looked up at him, her eyes already red from the tears she had shed earlier. She nodded, but there was a hesitation in her movement, a sense of uncertainty in the way she held herself. "I'm listening," she whispered, barely meeting his gaze. John took a step forward, his breath steady but forced. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, an apology, more answers, an explanation, but something in him told him this conversation was the breaking point. It was now or never. "You say you needed someone else to make you feel seen, Claire," he began, his voice shaking despite his efforts to remain composed. "But that's not what I'm struggling with right now. I can understand that. Hell, maybe I even saw it coming. We've been disconnected for a while, but—" He stopped himself, trying to control the anger that was bubbling up again. "But this is something else." Claire didn't speak at first. and for a long, agonizing moment, there was only the sound of their breaths filling the space. John could feel the frustration building inside him, but he couldn't stop now. He needed to know how far Claire was willing to go to save them, if that was even possible. "How far did it go, Claire?" he asked, his voice rough. "How far did you let it go with him? How many lies did you tell me while you were with him?" Claire's eyes filled with tears once more, but she didn't look away. Her voice was barely a whisper, as if each word was a struggle to say. "I never meant for it to happen this way, John. I never wanted to hurt you. It was just lunches at first, conversations I thought were harmless. But then it became more. We kissed. She choked on the words, closing her eyes as if the memory of it burned her. John's heart slammed in his chest. Kissed. The word cut through him like a knife. It wasn't the betrayal of the affair itself that hurt the most. It was the fact that Claire had been willing to share something so intimate with another man, something that was supposed to be sacred between them. He felt his vision blur, the anger clouding his thoughts, but he pushed it aside, forcing himself to focus on her. "You're telling me you were having lunch, talking about whatever, but then you kissed him? Was that just an accident, Claire? Was that just some slip of the tongue?" "No, this was deliberate," John said, each word heavy with disbelief. "You let it happen, and now you expect me to just accept it?" Claire lowered her head, shaking it slowly. "I never wanted it to go this far, but I couldn't stop it. I couldn't. Adam made me feel alive, John. He paid attention to me. I thought I could get away with just a little." She stopped, her words breaking apart as if she was trying to piece together something that no longer made sense to her. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." John took a deep breath, his chest tightening with each passing second. He couldn't stop the torrent of emotions from rising in him. Didn't mean to? He had heard that excuse too many times in his life. It was always a choice, no matter how much one tried to downplay it. "But you did let it go this far," he said, his voice quieter now, the anger mixing with a painful sadness. "And now we're here. I'm standing in front of you, and I don't even know who you are anymore. I don't recognize this woman who would do something like this." Claire opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling, but John stepped back, out of her reach. The physical space between them now felt like an abyss. "I don't even know if I want you to touch me right now, Claire," he said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. He turned his back on her, walking towards the door. The damage was done. No matter how much they talked, no matter how many apologies were said, the trust was gone. Could he ever rebuild that? Could they rebuild what they once had? He stopped just short of the door and turned back to face her, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you want to fix this, if you want me to even think about trying, then you have to prove it, Claire. Prove that you're willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. You can't just apologize and expect me to forgive you. This is going to take time, if it can even be fixed at all." She stood there, her hands now clasped tightly together, her face a mask of guilt and fear. "I will do anything, John. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." John didn't reply. He just walked out the door, leaving Claire standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the broken pieces of their marriage. He wasn't sure if he had made the right decision, but one thing was certain. Their lives, their future had just changed forever. The days after the confrontation passed in a blur of silence and unresolved tension. John's mind was consumed by the image of Claire's tear-streaked face. But more than that, he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that burned through him. The words she had said, "I kissed him," had lodged themselves in his mind like a splinter, refusing to leave. He had asked for space, but what he really needed now was something more tangible, something that would provide him with clarity, a way to either move forward or close this chapter for good. The need for truth gnawed at him. How far had Claire's relationship with Adam gone? What had she not told him? Could he even trust what she had confessed? John had never been the type to jump to conclusions, but this was different. This wasn't just an argument or a simple misunderstanding. This was about the foundation of everything he had known. John decided to take action. He wasn't sure where to start, how far he should go to uncover the full extent of the affair. But one thing was clear. If Claire wanted to prove that she was willing to fix this, he needed to see it for himself. He had to know everything, no matter how painful it was. The first thing he did was check her phone. It felt wrong, invasive, but in that moment he didn't care. He opened the screen to find a series of text messages between Claire and Adam. The tone was casual at first, just lunch plans, innocent enough, but as the days went on, the messages became more frequent, more flirtatious. Claire had even shared a photo of herself, laughing at something Adam had said. John felt a tightness in his chest, the pain of knowing that all this time Claire had been opening up to someone else, someone who wasn't him. The evidence was there, undeniable and raw, but John needed more. He needed to understand why Claire had been so willing to risk everything, why she had crossed that line. He started following Claire when she left for work, watching from a distance as she went about her day. At first, it felt like a betrayal of his own integrity, but the more he did it, the more the anger that had been bubbling beneath the surface began to solidify. He wasn't stalking her, he was seeking answers, and each time she walked past the coffee shop where she and Adam had met, each time she crossed a street she'd walked down with him so many times, his resolve grew stronger. He saw them one afternoon. Adam had picked Claire up from work, and the two of them were walking together toward her car, laughing. There was a familiarity in the way they interacted. Comfortable, easy. It wasn't just a fling, it was something more. The way Adam looked at her was different from how John had ever looked at her. There was an intimacy in it, a closeness that hurt to witness. John's chest tightened as a feeling of helplessness swept over him. He couldn't escape the reality that his wife was no longer his. The confrontation with Adam earlier had been enough to push him toward action, but now, watching Claire with Adam, John realized just how deep the betrayal ran. This wasn't a one-off mistake or a brief lapse in judgment. This was something that had been building for months, something Claire had allowed to flourish. How could he ever reconcile this with the woman he once knew? He didn't approach them then. He couldn't. He simply watched as they shared a moment, unaware of his presence. The distance between them felt like an ocean. He wanted to scream, to walk up and demand answers, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. Adam was a master of manipulation, and Claire, well, she was lost in her own emotions. Later that evening, when Claire came home, she was quiet, distant. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. John could see it in the way she avoided looking him in the eye, the way her shoulders tensed when she passed him in the hallway. He knew she knew. After dinner, he sat down on the couch, and for the first time in days, Claire joined him, her body stiff, her movements hesitant. John didn't say anything at first. He didn't have to. His eyes were enough to tell her that he knew more than she had intended. "I saw you today," he said, his voice low but steady. "With him, Adam." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She had hoped, at least, that John wouldn't push for more answers, wouldn't see what had really been happening. But now he had caught her in the lie she had been trying to cover up. "I didn't want you to find out like this," Claire said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how to tell you everything." John shook his head slowly. "You didn't have to tell me, Claire. I already know. I've seen it. I've watched you, seen the way he looks at you. How long has this been going on? How much longer were you going to keep this from me?" Claire broke down in tears, her face crumpling as the reality of the situation hit her full force. "I'm so sorry, John. I never meant for you to find out like this. I thought I could fix things on my own, but I didn't know how. I thought maybe I could fix myself with him." John leaned back on the couch, exhausted. "You didn't need to fix yourself with anyone, Claire. Not with him, not with anyone. You needed to fix us. And now, look where we are." Claire reached out, her hand trembling, but John pulled away. He couldn't bring himself to touch her, not now. The distance between them had only grown wider. "I'm going to figure out what comes next," John said, standing up. "But I need you to understand something. Trust isn't something you get back overnight, and right now it's shattered. Maybe one day we can rebuild it, but that's not today." John had never imagined he would find himself in this position, But now, standing outside the office building where Adam worked, he felt a cold determination rise within him. He had spent the last few days in turmoil, the quiet after the storm only amplifying the pain. But today was different. Today he would face the man who had taken so much from him, the man who had shattered his trust and caused his world to unravel. The weight of his decision settled on his shoulders. Claire had confessed, but she had only scratched the surface. The real truth lay in the confrontation with Adam. John wasn't sure what he expected from this meeting. Was he looking for an apology, closure, or was he just hoping to find something that could make the betrayal easier to stomach? Either way, he needed answers, and Adam was the key. Adam had been playing a dangerous game, and now it was time to show him the consequences of his actions. As John stepped into the lobby, his footsteps felt heavy. He knew Adam would be at the front desk waiting to greet clients, to charm people with that polished, easy smile. But today that smile would be gone. Today, Adam wouldn't have the upper hand. John walked up to the receptionist and, with a barely contained edge to his voice, asked to see Adam Taylor. The receptionist looked up in confusion, as if she had never seen him before, but then quickly nodded. "Mr. Taylor's office is on the second floor. I'll let him know you're here." John nodded curtly and moved toward the elevator. His heart was pounding, not with fear, but with a deep, gnawing anger that had been festering since he had first discovered the affair. When the elevator doors closed, he took a steadying breath, trying to calm the storm that raged inside him. He wasn't just angry at Adam. He was angry at himself. Angry that he hadn't seen the signs sooner. Angry that he had let things get this far. But most of all, he was angry that his marriage, his family, was now hanging by a thread. The elevator dinged as it reached the second floor, and John stepped out, his eyes immediately locking onto Adam's office door. The man was there, sitting behind a large desk, his expression unreadable. The moment their eyes met, Adam stood up slowly, a smirk beginning to form on his lips. The cockiness that John had come to expect was present, but there was something else there too: uncertainty. "John," Adam greeted him smoothly as if they were old friends. "I wasn't expecting you. What brings you here?" John's gaze didn't waver. "We need to talk, Adam. Now." Adam's smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, gesturing for John to take a seat. "I'm listening. What's on your mind?" John didn't sit. Instead, he moved toward the desk, leaning forward with an intensity that made Adam shift in his chair. "What's on my mind?" John's voice was low, dangerous. You're on my mind." Adam raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by the directness. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to deflect. But John could see the sweat beginning to bead on Adam's forehead. "Oh, I think you do," John said, his voice sharp. "You've been seeing my wife, Adam, behind my back, under my nose, and now you've taken everything from me." Adam shifted uncomfortably but tried to stay calm. "Look, John, I didn't want things to turn out like this. You have to understand, it wasn't personal. Claire, she was unhappy. We're both adults. She came to me for comfort, and I—" "Stop," John snapped, cutting him off. "You're not going to justify this. You don't get to claim innocence here. You knew exactly what you were doing. You were playing a game. And now look where we are." Adam opened his mouth to speak, but John continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "I watched you with her. I saw you laughing with her, sharing intimate moments. You thought you were getting away with something, didn't you? Thought you could just take what wasn't yours and leave the wreckage behind. Well, here's the thing. You don't get to walk away from this. You don't get to destroy everything I've worked for, everything we've built, and just act like it doesn't matter." There was a long pause, the tension between them palpable. Adam seemed to hesitate, his usual cocky demeanor slipping just a little. He leaned back in his chair, looking uneasy. "Look, I'm sorry if I've caused you pain, but Claire, she didn't need to be with me for that long. She came to me. I just gave her what she wanted." John's anger flared at Adam's words. "What she wanted," he repeated, his voice rising. "You think you can just walk in and play the hero, the savior? You took my wife, Adam. You crossed a line, and now you're trying to make it sound like it was some kind of favor? You think that makes it better?" Adam's face reddened, and for a moment John saw something real, the vulnerability of a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. "I'm not here to apologize, John," Adam said finally, his voice steady but strained. "But I will tell you this. Claire and I were never the problem. The problem is you, man. You weren't there for her. You were too busy with your career to even see what was happening in your own home." John froze, the sting of Adam's words cutting deeper than anything else. "That's the truth, isn't it?" Adam continued, his tone a bit softer now. "You weren't giving her what she needed. I saw that the first time I met her, and I gave it to her. She came to me because she was alone, and I was there." John's hands balled into fists at his sides. Every fiber of his being wanted to explode in anger, but he knew better. This wasn't just about Adam. This was about everything he had neglected. This was about the years he had let slip by while chasing success, while thinking work was the most important thing. "I know what you did," John said quietly, his voice thick with both rage and sorrow. "And I won't let you get away with it. You've taken enough from me. Now it's time for you to face the consequences." Adam straightened in his chair, his arrogance returning. "You think you can intimidate me, John? I don't care what you do. Claire's made her choice." John leaned in closer, his eyes locking with Adam's. "You might think this is over, but it's far from it. You'll regret this." The days following John's confrontation with Adam were a blur of confusion and overwhelming guilt. Claire hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly, hadn't anticipated the emotional tornado that would follow the collapse of her affair. Her world, once neatly organized around work, her family and the fragile connection she still had with John, had now unraveled, thread by painful thread. She had spent the first few days in silence, reflecting on what she had done, and the weight of her actions crushed her. The affair with Adam had started as an escape, a way to feel alive again after years of feeling emotionally distant from John. But now, sitting alone in their home, it felt like a dream that had turned into a nightmare. She had betrayed everything she held dear, her marriage, her family, herself, and she didn't know how to fix it. The weight of her decisions sat heavy in her chest, making it hard to breathe. Claire had tried to talk to John after he found out. She had tried to apologize, but the words never felt like enough. She knew she couldn't take back what she had done, but part of her desperately wished she could. The man she loved, the man who had been her partner for so many years, was standing before her, broken and angry. She had pushed him too far, and now she wasn't sure if there was anything left to save. The guilt gnawed at her. Every moment she spent thinking about Adam made her feel sick, like she had betrayed not only John but herself as well. She hadn't wanted this to happen. She hadn't wanted to fall into the trap of seeking comfort in someone else's arms, but she had. And now, as the realization set in, she understood the depth of her mistake. She couldn't erase what she had done, but she could try to make it right. That was the one thing she had control over. But how could she? How could she ever hope to rebuild a life with John after everything she had done? The questions haunted her, keeping her up late into the night, tossing and turning in the bed they once shared. One afternoon, Claire found herself standing in the living room, staring out the window, her hands pressed against the cold glass. The silence in the house was unbearable, and the absence of John's presence made it feel even more hollow. She missed him. She missed the man who had been her partner in everything, the man who had been there when she needed him, even though they had lost their way. And now she wasn't sure if he would ever come back to her. Her mind wandered back to the moments when everything had started to change. It hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow, gradual process, small cracks in their marriage that over time had become wider and deeper. John's work had always come first, and Claire had tried to understand that, tried to make peace with the distance between them. But something had shifted inside her. She had stopped feeling seen, stopped feeling heard. And when Adam had come along, offering attention and affection, it had felt like a lifeline. She hadn't meant for it to go this far, but somewhere along the way, she had let it happen. She sank down onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. The shame was overwhelming. She had promised herself that she would never be that person, the one who betrayed their spouse, the one who destroyed their family. Yet here she was, a stranger in her own home, unsure of how to fix the wreckage she had caused. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table and she glanced at it, hoping for a message from John. But it was from Lena, her best friend. "I know you're struggling, but you need to talk to John. He deserves the truth. You owe him that much." Claire sighed, feeling a pang of guilt in her chest. Lena had been right all along. Claire had been hiding from the truth, burying it beneath excuses and justifications. But now, she knew that the only way to move forward was to face what she had done head-on. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her phone and dialed John's number. The line rang, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, his voicemail picked up. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "John, I know you don't want to hear from me right now, but I need to say something. I need to apologize, truly apologize for everything. I made a terrible mistake and I'm so sorry for hurting you. I don't know what's next for us, but I promise you that I will do everything I can to make things right, if you'll give me the chance." She hung up the phone, feeling a small sense of relief, but the heavy silence that followed only made her feel more isolated. She wasn't sure what John would do or if he even wanted to hear from her. All she could do now was wait, and in that waiting, she realized just how much she had taken for granted. In the days that followed, Claire focused on herself. She started therapy, something she should have done long ago. She needed to understand why she had made the choices she did, why she had sought comfort in another man instead of confronting the problems in her marriage. She needed to find the root of her unhappiness, the part of herself that had allowed her to disconnect from John and to let someone else in. But even as she worked on herself, Claire couldn't shake the guilt. She knew that no amount of therapy or self-reflection could undo the damage she had done. The only thing that could save their marriage, if it could be saved at all, was time and effort, and she was more than willing to put in both. The hardest part of all was the waiting for John's response, the waiting for the chance to prove that she was truly sorry, the waiting to see if their love could survive this. The air in John's office felt thick with tension as he sat across from Daniel, his childhood friend and lawyer. He had been here before, many years ago, when they had discussed business ventures, new opportunities, and the future. But today was different. Today, the future felt uncertain, darkened by the storm that had engulfed his marriage. The weight of the conversation ahead felt suffocating, and for the first time, John realized how deeply everything had changed. Claire's betrayal had left him shattered, but now the reality of their situation was beginning to take shape. There were practical decisions to be made, decisions about their home, their finances, their children, if they had to go down the path of separation or divorce. And as much as John hated the idea of it, he knew that he had to be prepared for what might come. "Thanks for coming on such short notice," John said quietly, pushing a folder of papers across the desk to Daniel. The folder was filled with details about their finances, their joint accounts, and everything that needed to be sorted if their marriage ended. The thought of going through with it, of finalizing the end of everything he had known, made his stomach churn, but he couldn't deny that part of him was already resigned to the idea. Daniel took the folder, flipping through it quickly before looking up at John with a steady gaze. "Of course, I know this is hard for you, but the truth is, John, we need to have a clear understanding of where things stand before you make any decisions, and I'm here to help you do that." John sighed, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "I don't even know where to start, Daniel. I love Claire, but what she did, I don't know how to get past it. She was with another man, she betrayed me, and now I don't know if I can ever trust her again." "I understand," Daniel said, his voice calm. "But this isn't just about the emotional side of things. This is about protecting yourself legally. You have to be prepared for all possibilities." John nodded slowly, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. He didn't want to think about the divorce, didn't want to imagine his life without Claire despite everything that had happened. But he had to be pragmatic, and Daniel's words hit home. He couldn't afford to ignore the reality that, for all he knew, Claire might not be able to win back his trust. "You've got two options," Daniel continued, pulling out a legal pad and jotting down a few notes. You can either try for a separation and attempt to reconcile, or you can move forward with divorce proceedings. The first is less final. It gives you time to see if you can work things out, if Claire is truly committed to rebuilding the relationship. The second, of course, is more permanent. It's a hard choice, John, but we need to have a plan in place no matter what. John's mind was a blur. He had imagined this conversation, but he had never thought it would come to this. He had always believed in the strength of his marriage, in the love they had shared. How had they gotten here? How had it all unraveled so quickly? His chest tightened at the thought of ending things with Claire. I don't know if I can just let it go, John admitted. I want to believe that she's sorry, that we can fix this, but every time I think about what she did, I feel sick. Daniel nodded, his expression sympathetic but firm. It's understandable, John. You're hurt. This isn't something you can just brush off. But the legal side of things is clear. You need to make sure you're protected, and you need to know what the consequences might be if you do decide to move forward with a divorce. John leaned back in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him, unable to focus on any one thing. Divorce seemed like a betrayal in and of itself, but staying in a marriage that had been shattered felt like a different kind of betrayal. A betrayal of his own heart, his own dignity. How could he move forward with someone who had done this to him? And yet, how could he just walk away from everything they had built? You'll also need to think about custody, Daniel added, breaking through John's thoughts. If there are kids involved, you'll want to discuss shared custody or whatever arrangement works best for you and Claire. If you're not planning on divorce just yet, it's still important to make sure your rights are protected, especially if things get complicated. John nodded, feeling the weight of the decisions ahead. He had always thought that his life would unfold in a predictable way. Work hard, build a family, make a future together. But now all of that seemed like a distant memory, a life that had slipped away without his realizing it. Do you think we can still save this, Daniel? John asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Can we still fix this? Is it even possible? Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then slowly closed the folder. That's something only you and Claire can figure out, John. You can go through the motions of legal protection, but at the end of the day, it comes down to what you both want. Do you want to try again? Do you believe in this marriage enough to rebuild it? John swallowed hard, struggling to find the answer. I don't know, he said quietly. I don't know if I can ever trust her again, but I still love her, and that makes everything so much harder. The silence between them grew heavy, and Daniel nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. Take your time, John. Think about it carefully. Whatever you choose, I'm here to help you through it. As John left Daniel's office, his heart was no lighter. The future remained uncertain, the weight of his decision hanging over him like a storm cloud. He wasn't sure what the right choice was. But one thing was clear. The consequences of this betrayal would linger long after the legal documents were signed. John sat in the quiet of his living room, the soft tick of the wall clock the only sound breaking the heavy silence. The weight of the decisions he had made over the last few days seemed to press down on him, and despite the clarity he had tried to find, his heart remained a battleground. His conversation with Daniel had been a necessary step, a practical one. But now, sitting alone in the house he had once shared with Claire, John found himself confronting the emotional side of it all. How could he possibly move forward? How could he forgive her for what she had done, for the betrayal that had shaken him to his core? The thought of the affair, of the hours Claire had spent with Adam, filled him with a deep, gnawing ache. Yet in the midst of all that pain, there was something else, a quiet flicker of longing. John still loved Claire. He couldn't deny it, no matter how much he wanted to. Even now, in the wake of everything, he missed her. The way she had laughed at his jokes, the way she had held his hand during their late-night walks, the way she had always known how to make him feel like he was enough. It all felt like a distant dream now, slipping away from him with each passing moment. But trust, he knew, wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. And every time he thought about what had happened, about what Claire had chosen to do, the bitterness rose up again. Was it worth it to try to salvage something that had been broken so completely? Would he ever be able to look at her the same way again? He ran a hand through his hair, standing up from the couch and pacing the room. Can I forgive her? He thought, the question echoing in his mind like a drumbeat. Can I forgive myself for not seeing it sooner? The questions weren't easy to answer. The anger was still there, simmering just below the surface, ready to flare up at the smallest reminder of what had happened. The image of Claire with Adam, laughing, sharing moments he had thought were meant only for him, kept replaying in his mind, each scene more painful than the last. But there was something else, something deeper than just anger, a sense of betrayal that went beyond the affair itself. John had spent so much time focusing on his work, on building a future for them, that he had missed the cracks in their relationship. He had neglected the emotional distance growing between him and Claire, and now it seemed impossible to ignore. Had I really been there for her? John wondered. Had I really been the husband she needed? The guilt gnawed at him, twisting his insides. He had put his career first, always thinking there would be time for everything else later. But now, later felt like it had come too late. Claire had needed him, needed his attention, and he hadn't given it to her. He had failed her just as much as she had failed him. He sank back down onto the couch, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Where do I go from here? The question loomed larger than anything else, filling his thoughts with doubt. Could they rebuild what they had, or was this the end? Was forgiveness even possible, or was their relationship forever tainted by what had happened? The thoughts felt overwhelming. Part of him wanted to just walk away, to leave it all behind and never look back. But then there was the other part of him, the part that still loved Claire, the part that remembered the woman he had married. How could I just throw that away? The conflict inside him was tearing him apart. John's phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. He glanced down at it, seeing Claire's name flash on the screen. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the screen. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend like he didn't care, to hold on to the anger that had been his shield for so long. But another part of him, the part that still cared, knew that avoiding her wouldn't solve anything. With a sigh, he swiped the screen, bringing the phone to his ear. John? Claire's voice was soft, almost tentative, as if she was afraid to speak too loudly, afraid of breaking something that was already fragile. Claire, he said, his voice low, heavy with emotion. I don't know what to say anymore. I don't know what's left. I know I've hurt you, Claire replied, her voice trembling with unshed tears. But I'm sorry, John, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. Please, let me try. John's throat tightened. He had heard her apologies before, had seen the tears, but he wasn't sure if he could trust them this time. You've said that before, Claire, but saying sorry doesn't change what happened. It doesn't take back the hurt. I know, she whispered. I can't undo what I've done, but I can promise you that I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm sorry. I don't want to lose you, John. I don't want to lose our family. John closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as the weight of her words settled on him. Is it enough? He wondered. Was her apology enough to rebuild what they had? Could he really move forward and trust her again? The silence stretched between them, neither of them knowing how to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. John's heart ached, but the questions remained unanswered. He didn't know if he was ready to forgive her, but he also knew that he wasn't ready to give up on everything they had fought for. I don't know, Claire, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can forgive you yet. I need time. I understand, she replied softly. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. The days following his conversation with Claire felt like a slow, agonizing crawl. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each hour filled with uncertainty and unspoken tension. John had given her the time she asked for, but as the days turned into weeks, the weight of his decision, whether to forgive or to walk away, grew heavier with every passing moment. He had thought that space would help, that the distance would give him clarity, but all it had done was deepen his confusion. Claire had called, sent texts, and even left messages asking to talk, to try and make things right. But John wasn't sure if he was ready. How could he be? The hurt still lingered, festering beneath the surface, each thought of Adam, of what Claire had done, filling him with a mixture of disgust and sorrow. But now, standing in their living room, looking around at the life they had built together, John knew the time for decisions had come. He couldn't keep putting it off. Either they would move forward or they would part ways forever. There was no middle ground anymore. John took a deep breath and glanced at his watch. It was almost time for Claire to arrive. The thought of seeing her again, of confronting everything they had been through, made his chest tighten. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for. Perhaps some sense of relief, or maybe some final piece of clarity that would make the decision for him. But whatever it was, he knew it had to happen now. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. He stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding, before he walked slowly toward the door. When he opened it, Claire was standing there, her eyes red and swollen as if she had been crying. She had always been beautiful to him, but now there was something raw and vulnerable in the way she looked at him, something that struck deep into his heart. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice trembling. She didn't move, almost as if waiting for permission to step inside. John stood for a moment, unsure of what to say, unsure of what he felt. But then, without a word, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. As she crossed the threshold, a quiet sorrow seemed to fill the space between them. They had been here so many times before, this house, their home, their sanctuary. But now it felt like a battlefield, the remnants of their love scattered in pieces, too broken to repair. Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with pain. "I know you've been struggling with this," she began, her voice steady but soft. "And I know that no matter what I say, it might not make a difference. But I want you to know, I'm sorry. I've never been more sorry in my life." John didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. The words he had been rehearsing in his head all week felt like they had evaporated the moment she spoke. Instead, he crossed the room, staring out the window at the street below, trying to steady himself. "I don't know what to say, Claire," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I don't know how we got here or how we fix it." Claire stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out toward him. "John," she whispered, "I want to make this right. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, believe me when I say that I've learned so much from my mistakes. I've been trying to change, to really look at what I've done and why I did it. I can't undo the past, but I can promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. Please give me that chance." John closed his eyes, the weight of her words crashing over him. He had never doubted Claire's love for him, not truly. But now, faced with the depth of her betrayal, he wasn't sure if love was enough. The path ahead was unclear, and he wasn't sure if he could ever trust her again. He turned back toward her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Claire," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "The pain, the betrayal, it cuts so deep. I can't just pretend that it didn't happen. But at the same time, I can't ignore the love we've shared. What we've had. I don't know if that's enough anymore." Claire's face crumpled and she stepped closer to him. "John, please, I know I've broken your heart. But I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. I'll fight for us, for our family, for everything we built together. You're the only one I want. Please give me that chance to show you that I can change." John swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the raw honesty of her plea. It was clear that she was committed to making things right. But was he ready to forgive her? Was he ready to believe that things could be different? He looked at Claire, her face still stained with tears, her hands trembling as she reached for him. And in that moment, John realized that forgiveness wasn't just about what Claire had done, it was about what he was willing to do. He had spent so much time focusing on the hurt, the betrayal, that he had neglected to consider his own role in their marriage. He had failed her too, in his own way. They had both failed, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to start over. "I don't know if I can ever completely forget what happened," John said quietly, his voice trembling. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to fight for us. I think we owe it to ourselves to try, even if it's hard. But we have to be honest with each other. No more lies, no more secrets. Claire's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of relief. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. I promise, John. No more lies. We'll do this together. As John held her, the weight of the moment settled over him. The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of healing, the beginning of finding a way back to the love they had once shared. The following weeks passed in a blur of reflection and cautious optimism. John and Claire had taken their first tentative steps toward rebuilding what had been shattered, but it wasn't easy. Trust, once broken, was not something that could be repaired with a simple apology or a few heartfelt conversations. It required effort, patience, and an understanding that the path to healing would be long and fraught with challenges. For the first time in a long time, they both committed to putting in the work. They had seen the cracks in their marriage before, the emotional distance, the unspoken frustrations, but now they were confronted with the reality of those cracks. They couldn't ignore them any longer. John was doing his best to let go of the anger, the bitter thoughts that had plagued him for so long. It wasn't easy. Every memory of Claire with Adam seemed to haunt him, but he found that as the days passed, those memories were becoming less sharp, less all-consuming. He was learning to replace them with new memories, ones where he saw Claire for who she truly was, someone who was struggling, yes, but someone who was also willing to fight for him, for them. Claire, on the other hand, was doing everything she could to prove her commitment to John. She had cut ties with Adam, distancing herself from the man who had come to represent a fleeting escape from her own unhappiness. The hardest part for her was looking at the pain in John's eyes, knowing that she had been the one to inflict it. She had made mistakes, yes, but she was also determined to show John that she was not defined by those mistakes. She could be the woman he had always known her to be, loving, loyal, and dedicated to their family. They had started seeing a couples therapist, someone who could help them navigate the complexities of their emotions and the baggage they carried from the affair. The therapy sessions were exhausting, each conversation peeling back layers of hurt and resentment, each session leaving them both emotionally drained. But through it all, they began to see glimmers of hope. Slowly, the tension in the house began to ease, and the silence that had once filled their home was now broken by small moments of laughter, shared meals, and late-night conversations. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, after a long day of work, John came home to find Claire sitting at the kitchen table, a soft smile on her face as she looked up from the book she was reading. For a moment, the familiar sight of her, the woman he had loved for so long, felt almost foreign to him. But then, as she looked up and their eyes met, something shifted. The anger, the hurt, those things were still there, but they didn't consume him the way they once had. "Hey," she said, setting the book down and standing to greet him. Her voice was soft, but there was a warmth in it, a tenderness that hadn't been there before. "How was your day?" John paused, watching her for a moment. He could see the effort in her eyes, the vulnerability she was still carrying, but there was also something else, something that felt like a spark of possibility. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of their entire relationship on his shoulders alone. They were in this together now, really in it together. "It was fine," John replied, his voice steady but soft. He walked over to her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I missed you." Claire's smile deepened as she stepped toward him, wrapping her arms around him in a slow, deliberate embrace. It felt different. This hug was full of meaning, full of promises, promises that both of them were still unsure of but willing to take on. Claire had shown him that she was willing to fight for their marriage, but more importantly, she had shown him that she was willing to fight for herself, and that, John realized, was what gave him hope. "I missed you too," she whispered, pulling back slightly to look at him. "I know it's been hard. I know I've hurt you and I can't change that, but I promise I'm here now. I'm really here." John nodded, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. "I know, and I'm here too. We're in this together, Claire. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." They stood there for a moment, just holding each other, the weight of the past still hanging over them but no longer defining them. For the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. It wasn't a clean break. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was a beginning, a new one. As they sat down to eat dinner together, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in weeks. There were still moments of tension, still questions about what the future would look like, but they were navigating them together. And for the first time, John believed that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for them, a way to heal, rebuild, and find a new version of happiness. Claire reached across the table, her hand brushing against his, and in that small touch, John felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. So, what's your take on this story? Do you believe that trust can truly be rebuilt after such a deep betrayal? Or is it better to walk away and start fresh? How would you handle a situation like John's, where forgiveness is on the line? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below and share your opinions. Also, if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel so you can stay updated with more emotional, heart-wrenching tales like this one. Where are you watching from? I'd love to hear from our viewers all around the world. Your thoughts matter and your voice makes our community stronger. Thank you for being part of this journey. Let's keep the conversation going. End of video.